think we both know there's nothing left to pretend.
Isaiah, I actually owe you a thank you. If you hadn't been so patient all these years, Celeste might never have gotten hungry enough to come this far. Is that what you both think?
You never tried to match what I built. Not once.
Are you certain this is how you want to end it?
This man is who belongs beside me.
My wife stood in the middle of that ballroom and declared herself free from a man she believed had contributed nothing to the life she was celebrating. She flipped that dinner table like it was the punctuation mark on a decision she had already made. What Celeste did not know, what no one in that room knew, was that the champagne she had just sent crashing to the floor, the venue surrounding her, the bonuses being handed out that night, and the company she had spent years climbing, all of it traced back to me. What happens when the man you humiliate owns the room you're standing in? If you've ever watched someone mistake silence for weakness and found out later just how wrong they were, this story is going to stay with you. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Because the night is far from over. My mother's hands told her whole story before she ever opened her mouth. Loretta Rowan worked the night shift at a crude oil processing facility in West Texas for 19 years, and by the time I was old enough to notice, her palms were mapped with calluses so thick they barely registered heat or cold. She never complained about them. She said hands that looked like hers were proof of something, proof that a person had shown up every single day and done what needed doing regardless of whether anyone was watching. That was the first lesson she gave me, and she gave it without a single word. The town we lived in wasn't the kind of place that made it into travel magazines or real estate listings. It was a cluster of worker housing set against flat, wind-beaten land where the smell of crude hung in the air so constantly that after a while you stopped noticing it entirely. I grew up listening to the sound of heavy trucks rolling out before dawn, watching the horizon glow orange some nights when the flares burned bright, learning early that the oil business was a machine that ran on the labor of people whose names would never appear in any annual report. My mother was one of those people. She knew it, and she was not ashamed of it, but she was determined that I would understand the machine from a different angle than she did. When Loretta died, she left me almost nothing in the traditional sense. The house had a small mortgage still attached to it. The savings account held enough to cover a few months of expenses if I was careful. What she did leave me wrapped in a piece of cloth inside a shoebox on the top shelf of her closet was a steel wrench, the same one she had carried through nearly 2 decades of overnight shifts. She had scratched 4 words into the handle herself, the letters uneven but deliberate. Build what no one can take from you. I held that wrench for a long time before I understood what she meant. It took me even longer to understand she had been planning to leave me exactly that message from the moment she realized I was paying attention to the world around me. I started in the industry the way most people without connections do, at the bottom doing contract work that no one else wanted. I read everything I could find about mineral rights lease agreements, pipeline infrastructure, land use contracts, and the financial structures that the large companies used to manage their assets. Most people treated that kind of reading as background noise, the fine print nobody wanted to wade through. I treated it as the actual story, because once you understood how those structures worked, you could see where the large companies were being lazy, where they had undervalued a tract of land or walked away from a lease because the projected return didn't justify their overhead, or failed to notice that 2 adjacent properties combined would produce something neither could on its own. That was how I began. Not with capital, not with investors, and not with a family name that opened doors. I found the overlooked corners of a business that was otherwise dominated by people who had inherited their position in it, and I worked those corners with everything I had. The first royalty check I received from a lease I had negotiated myself was small enough to seem almost insulting. I framed a copy of it anyway, not because of the amount, but because it was proof that the method worked, that a person who understood the structure of a thing could find value inside it that other people had walked past without seeing. Every dollar I earned after that went back into the next acquisition, the next lease, the next position. Red Mesa Energy Holdings did not arrive fully formed. It grew slowly the way real things grow, accumulating mass over years, rather than appearing overnight as a finished structure. By the time the company was worth what it was worth, I had been building it for close to 2 decades. The holdings included production assets, a network of pipeline interests, storage facilities, transportation contracts, drilling services, and equity positions in several other energy companies. None of it had been handed to me. Every piece of it had been found, evaluated, negotiated, and built with the same logic my mother had scratched into that wrench handle. The structure was deliberately private, run through holding companies and trusts managed by attorneys I had worked with for years, the most senior of whom was Eleanor Briggs, a woman who had seen enough of the industry to know that the most dangerous thing a person in my position could do was become publicly visible too early. I kept my name off the masthead for reasons that had nothing to do with shame and everything to do with strategy. The moment your name becomes attached to a number that large, everyone you have ever known begins to see you differently. Not necessarily better, but differently. The relationships change. The conversations change. The space between what people say to your face and what they mean underneath it widens until you can no longer trust either side of it. I had watched that happen to other people in the industry, and I had no interest in experiencing it myself, which is part of what made meeting Celeste feel like something I had not expected. She was working in strategy consulting at the time, early in her career, moving quickly because she was genuinely sharp, and because she had the kind of focused ambition that made her effective at almost everything she attempted. What drew me to her was not the ambition itself, but the fact that it seemed to exist alongside something else, a directness, a refusal to perform warmth. She didn't actually feel an honesty that could come across as blunt, but that I found steadying after years of spending time around people who carefully managed every word they said. She told me exactly what she thought. She laughed at things that were actually funny. She did not seem particularly interested in what I drove or where I ate or what my title was, which in my world was rarer than it sounds. I chose not to tell her the full picture of what I had built. That was a decision I made consciously, and I have thought about it many times since. Part of my reasoning was simple caution. I had learned from watching others that money introduced into a new relationship changes the chemistry of that relationship in ways that are very difficult to reverse. But there was another part of my reasoning that I will admit was also a test, though I would not have called it that at the time. I wanted to know who Celeste was when she thought I was an ordinary person. I wanted to know how she treated someone who had nothing obvious to offer her. I thought I had found my answer in those early years, and for a while I believed I was right. After we married, I continued to present the same face to the world, a man who ran a modest energy investment consulting operation. Nothing that warranted much attention. I made sure the company where Celeste worked, Blackstone Ridge Petroleum Services, had access to the capital it needed to grow. I did this quietly through channels that gave no indication of where the money originated. I told myself I was simply supporting her career the way a partner supports the work of someone they love. What I did not account for was what would happen to the relationship between us as Blackstone Ridge expanded and Celeste rose through its structure title by title, office by office, until she was its vice president of strategy. Success, it turns out, is a lens. It does not create a person's character, it magnifies what was already there. And what the success magnified in Celeste was something I had not seen clearly enough in the earlier years, or perhaps had seen and chosen to interpret charitably. As her profile in the industry grew, the way she talked about the people around her began to change. The directness I had admired became something sharper and less generous. The ambition that had seemed clean and forward-looking began to carry a comparison embedded in it, not just a drive toward something, but a continuous measurement of herself against the people beside her, including me. At dinner parties and industry events, she began introducing me in a way that was technically accurate but designed to diminish. She would say I did a bit of consulting or that I wasn't really a corporate world person, always with the slightly apologetic tone of someone excusing a guest who had shown up underdressed. I heard it every time. I did not react because reacting would have required explaining things I was not yet ready to explain, and also because I understood even then that the way a person introduces their partner in a room full of colleagues reveals more about that person than it does about the partner being introduced. Gavin Pierce entered the picture as Celeste's colleague, and eventually as the director of business development at Blackstone Ridge. He was the kind of man who had built his entire professional identity on the performance of access. He knew the names of important people, referenced deals in casual conversation, the way others referenced the weather, and wore his connections as visibly as his suits. He was effective at creating the impression of power, which is a different thing from actually having it. But in the rooms he occupied, the distinction rarely came up. What I noticed about Gavin was not his confidence, but his technique. The habit of landing insults so precisely wrapped in the language of respect that the target was left with no clean way to respond. The first time Gavin spoke to me directly, it was at a dinner that Celeste had arranged for her leadership team. He looked across the table with a smile that had been practiced enough to feel natural, and said that he found it admirable the way I had chosen a life that didn't require me to prove anything to anyone. It was a sentence that sounded like a compliment if you read only the surface of it. What it actually said for anyone listening beneath the surface was that I had nothing worth proving. I held his gaze for a moment and then asked the man sitting next to me about a production project I had read about in the Permian Basin. I could feel Gavin recalibrate slightly. He had expected either a flicker of embarrassment or a defensive response, and I had given him neither. That small exchange told me everything I needed to know about how he operated, and I filed it away without comment. What I did not know yet, or rather what I had not yet confirmed, was that Gavin and Celeste had moved well past a professional relationship. I discovered it the way I discovered most important things in my professional life, through documentation. Blackstone Ridge had submitted a capital expansion request to Red Mesa's Investment Review Committee, $1.2 billion to support a significant growth initiative. The request landed on my desk in the form of a summary prepared by Eleanor, and attached to it were the expense records that the committee had pulled during routine due diligence. The records showed travel expenses, hotel reservations, overlapping itineraries across multiple cities, and a pattern of joint expenditures that had no legitimate business explanation. The two executives named as the primary sponsors of the capital request were Celeste and Gavin. I read through the documentation twice. Then I set it on the corner of my desk and looked out the window for a while. Eleanor asked me that afternoon how I wanted to proceed. She had worked with me long enough to know that I did not make decisions quickly when the stakes were personal, and she waited without pressing. I told her to do nothing. Not yet. She looked at me in the way she sometimes did when she thought I was making a choice she wouldn't have made herself, but she accepted the answer without argument because she also understood why I had given it. If I had moved against them at that moment, I would have closed a door before I had seen what was on the other side of it. I already knew what Gavin was: a man who used other people's ambition as a vehicle for his own. But Celeste was my wife. And the question I needed answered was not whether she had done what the documents suggested. That question had already been answered. The question that remained was harder. Who was she when she believed I had no power to respond? How far would she go when she thought the cost of going there was zero? I wanted to know that answer in its full form, undiluted by intervention, before I decided what to do with it. So I waited, and I let her keep moving toward whatever she had decided to move toward. And I carried that knowledge alone, quietly, without announcing it to anyone, while the world around me continued to assume it understood what it was looking at. The wrench was still in my jacket pocket on the night of the gala. It had been in one pocket or another for as long as I could remember, not as a reminder of anything specific, but because it was the one object I owned that had no ambiguity attached to it. Every other thing I had built or accumulated came with complexity, with structures and agreements and people and obligations layered around it. The wrench was just a tool a woman had carried through 19 years of overnight shifts, and it was mine because she had decided to leave it to me, and that was the entirety of what it was. In a life that had grown very complicated, there was something clarifying about keeping something that simple close to hand. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes not from being alone, but from being present in a room where everyone has already decided who you are. I had grown accustomed to it by the time the pattern with Celeste became impossible to ignore the slightly lowered voice when she introduced me, the way she angled her body away from mine at events, the pauses that appeared in sentences she was constructing about our life together as though she were choosing words carefully enough to avoid having to commit to anything specific. I noticed all of it. I said nothing because saying something would have required me to acknowledge that what I was watching was not a phase but a direction, and I was not yet ready to accept the full weight of that. The dinner at Celeste's mother's house that winter made the direction undeniable. Marjorie Harrow had a talent for communicating disapproval through generosity. She would offer something with one hand and take something larger back with the other, always in the same smooth motion, always with the expression of someone doing you a favor. That evening, she had set the table with particular care, which I had learned over the years was a sign that she had something she intended to say and wanted the setting to carry some of the freight of it. About halfway through the meal, she asked Celeste why we had not yet moved into a larger house, given how well things were going at Blackstone Ridge. The question was addressed to Celeste but aimed at me. Celeste answered without looking in my direction. She said it was because the numbers didn't quite work the way they needed to, by which she meant my numbers, which everyone at the table understood without her having to specify. Her sister Kendall, who had been waiting for an opening, said something about how Celeste had always been the kind of person who would have gotten further faster if she hadn't been so loyal to the people around her. The sentence ended there, but its shape was complete. I was the person around her. I was what loyalty to someone undeserving looked like. I sat with that understanding and ate my food, and did not give either of them the reaction they were waiting for, which I could see frustrated them more than any argument would have. What I thought about sitting at that table was not anger. What I thought about was the fact that Marjorie and Kendall were not wrong about the surface of things. They were only working with the information they had been given, which was the information Celeste had chosen to give them. A man who drove a modest car, who had no visible corporate title, who did not attend the kinds of events his wife attended, who did not seem to be generating the kind of income that matched the circles Celeste now moved in. Measured by those visible markers, I was exactly what they thought I was. The problem was not their conclusion. The problem was the measuring system they were using and the fact that Celeste had come to share it so completely that she could sit at that table and let her family speak about her husband that way, without a single word in response. About a month before the gala, there was a networking event that I attended alongside Celeste because she had asked me to come, though. Her reasons for asking had more to do with appearance than with wanting my company. Gavin was there working the room in the way he always worked. Rooms moving from cluster to cluster, touching arms, laughing at the right moments, distributing the impression of influence, the way a person distributes business cards. When he made his way to where I was standing, he brought a small audience with him, which I suspected was not accidental. One of the other executives in the group asked me about what I was working on, a straightforward, polite question of the kind people ask at these events when they have not yet found a more interesting conversation. Before I had formed a complete response, Gavin was already speaking. He said he thought it was genuinely admirable the way I seemed comfortable operating at my own pace, without the pressure that came with having to prove yourself in competitive environments. He said he imagined it was actually quite freeing. Then he looked at Celeste with the satisfied expression of someone who has just done someone a favor, as though he had defended me. The people around us smiled the way people smile when they're not sure what else to do, and Celeste did not intervene. What Gavin had done for anyone listening carefully was tell a room full of industry professionals that I existed outside the competitive world they all inhabited, that I was not a participant, but a bystander. I looked at him for a moment, then turned back to the executive who had asked the original question and mentioned a pipeline development I had been tracking in the Delaware Basin. Gavin recalibrated again, and this time I could see him filing something away, a small notation that I was not responding the way he had predicted. It was around this time that Celeste told me she had made a decision. She did not frame it as a conversation, she said. She thought we both knew the marriage had run its course and that she wanted to move forward without the weight of pretending otherwise. She said it in the kitchen on a Tuesday evening with the same composed efficiency she brought to professional decisions, as though she had already completed the internal deliberation and was now simply announcing the outcome. I asked her if she was certain this was where she wanted to land. She said she was. I did not argue because there was nothing left to argue about, and also because I had already understood from the expense records, from the networking events, from the dinners at her mother's house, that whatever the marriage had been, its present form was something I was no longer willing to protect. I drove out to West Texas the weekend after that kitchen conversation. Not for any practical reason, Eleanor handled the operational complexity of my life with a systematic precision that rarely required my physical presence anywhere specific. I drove out because I needed to be somewhere that I understood completely. Somewhere the geography had not changed, and the language of the place was still the one I had grown up speaking. I went to the small house where my mother had lived, which I still owned and kept in reasonable condition, and I sat in the main room for a long time without turning on many lights. The wrench was already with me, as it always was, but being in that house made its weight feel different. I thought about something my mother had said to me once when I was still young enough to find the patience she modeled genuinely puzzling. She had told me there was a difference between being strong enough not to need to prove your strength and being so quiet that your silence became permission. She said the first one was a virtue, and the second one was a mistake that dressed itself up as a virtue to avoid being corrected. Sitting in that room, I began to think I had perhaps been making the second error and calling it the first one. Allowing Celeste to believe I had no power was a choice I had made for reasons I believed were sound. But there was a version of that choice that had curdled into something else, into a passivity that was no longer protecting anyone, but was instead creating a space in which two people were using a company's money and a company's trust to serve their own interests, while I sat at the side of the room and said nothing. Eleanor called me the following Monday, with news she delivered in the careful, unhurried way she delivered everything that required careful handling. The restructuring of a $6.8 billion set of Red Mesa assets had reached a stage that required my direct participation. The relevant shareholders and board members needed to be assembled, and my presence as founder and controlling shareholder was not optional. The date that worked for every required party was the same evening as the Blackstone Ridge annual gala. The location that had been arranged because it was the only venue in Houston that could accommodate both the scale of the event and the security requirements of the meeting was the Sterling Crown Pavilion on Buffalo Bayou. The gala would occupy the main event spaces. The board session would occur in a secured suite on the upper floor beginning after the formal program concluded. I listened to all of this without comment, and then I asked Eleanor to confirm the details in writing. She said she would. She also said in the measured tone she used when she was expressing an opinion without stating it directly that the timing was something we should think carefully about. I told her I had already thought about it. That same evening, a message arrived from Celeste. She said she wanted me at the gala. She intended to end things there in front of the people who mattered in her professional world, and that she thought it was better for both of us to be present when that happened. The message had the quality of a stage direction. She had decided not just what the ending would be, but what the setting would look like. What she did not know could not have known, because I had never given her any reason to know it was that she had just invited the owner of the building to attend a party being held in his own rooms. I typed back 2 sentences. I told her I would be there. The night of the gala. The Sterling Crown Pavilion was everything Blackstone Ridge needed it to be for the impression the company wanted to make. More than 300 guests moved through the space, executives from across the energy sector, institutional investors, legal advisors, international partners, and the senior employees who had been told their performance had earned them a seat at the table. The room was arranged with the kind of attention that communicates serious money without appearing to try too hard. Every element of the evening, the space, the catering, the entertainment, the performance bonuses that would be announced before the night was over, had been funded through a hospitality and events budget that traced back through 3 layers of corporate structure to Red Mesa. The champagne being poured, the floral arrangements on every table, the custom awards waiting backstage, all of it had been paid for by my company. But no one in that room knew that, and no one was supposed to know it yet. I arrived without announcement, without anyone accompanying me, and found my seat at a table near the back of the room. Celeste had arranged the seating herself, and the message in the placement was clear. This was where the evening's least important guest would sit, far from the stage, facing the backs of the people whose opinions she cared about. Celeste was at the center of the room with Gavin beside her, and the body language between them was the body language of two people who had stopped being careful. She was animated in a way I had not seen in a long time, and Gavin had his hand at the small of her back, working the room in his usual fashion. The two of them together projected exactly the image they had decided they wanted to project. Marjorie passed my table on the way to her own seat, and looked at me with an expression that managed to be both pitying and satisfied, as though my presence at the back of the room confirmed something she had always suspected. She said, in a low voice, that at least I would get to see the world Celeste had built for herself. I smiled and said nothing. The formal program moved through its early stages: remarks from the CEO, recognition of high-performing teams, a short presentation on growth projections. Celeste was introduced with her full title and received a sustained round of applause that she accepted with the composed ease of someone who had practiced receiving recognition. Gavin sat close and watched her with the proprietary satisfaction of a man who has decided he owns something before the transaction has been finalized. About an hour into the evening, Gavin rose from his seat and moved deliberately in my direction. I was not heading toward the bar or toward another table. He was coming toward me specifically, and he brought with him the natural audience of people who happened to be standing nearby. He stopped close enough that the distance itself was a statement, looked down at me with the expression he had been perfecting for months, and spoke at a volume carefully calibrated to carry without appearing to be a performance. "You know, Isaiah," he said, his tone carrying that practiced warmth that was never quite warm, "I actually owe you a thank you. If you hadn't been so patient all these years, so consistently, reliably patient, Celeste might never have gotten hungry enough to come this far." He let the sentence land. The people nearby had heard it. He knew they had heard it. The sentence did exactly what it was designed to do. It reframed every year of our marriage as Celeste's endurance of a limitation, and positioned me as the obstacle whose passivity had paradoxically fueled her ambition. It was the most precisely calibrated thing he had said to me across the entire span of our acquaintance, and he delivered it with the ease of someone who had been saving it for exactly this setting. I looked at him for the long moment. Then I picked up my water glass and took a slow drink and set it back down without responding. The silence I returned to him was not the silence of a man who had no answer. It was the silence of a man who had decided the answer could wait a little longer. Gavin held my gaze for another second, then turned back toward the room with the satisfied expression of a man who believes he has just won something. He had not won anything. He had simply finished the last hand before the cards were turned over. It was Celeste who came to my table next. The room shifted the way rooms shift when something is about to happen that everyone can feel, but no one has confirmed yet. She stood across from me and said she was glad I had come, in a tone that made clear she was not glad at all. She said it was time to stop pretending. She said I had never been a part of the world she was standing in, that she had spent years trying to bring me into it, and years watching me refuse to grow into the person she needed beside her. Her voice was steady and deliberate, rehearsed in the way that things are rehearsed when a person wants to make sure emotion doesn't interfere with delivery. I asked her one question. I asked if she was certain this was how she wanted to end it. The question landed wrong. She had expected either an argument or a retreat, and a question that simply held its ground gave her nothing to push against. Gavin appeared at her side close enough that his presence was a statement, and the people at the surrounding tables had stopped their own conversations entirely. The recording devices came out almost unconsciously, the way they do when a crowd senses something worth capturing. Celeste reached the end of her patience and expressed it with her whole body. She put both hands on the edge of the table and drove it forward with a force that sent everything on its surface crashing to the floor. Plates, glasses, silverware, 2 bottles of champagne that scattered across the marble in a cascade of broken crystal and foam. The sound of it cut through the entire room like a stone through still water. Everything stopped. Every conversation, every movement, every breath seemed to recalibrate around the sound of breaking glass and the sudden silence that followed it. She pulled the ring from her finger and threw it down onto the floor in front of me. Not a careful placement, but a hard, deliberate throw, the kind of motion that comes from a decision already made at the level of the body before the mind has finished ratifying it. The ring skipped once on the marble and came to rest a foot from where I was sitting. Then she reached out and pulled Gavin into the space beside her, and she said in a voice carrying enough to reach the far edges of the room that she was standing next to the man who was actually capable of standing beside her. Marjorie moved towards her daughter. Kendall moved toward her sister. The phones were already up across the room. I looked at the ring on the floor. I looked at Celeste's face, which held an expression I had not seen before. Not anger, not triumph exactly, but something closer to relief. The relief of a person who has finally said out loud the thing they have been holding for a very long time. And in that relief, I found the answer to the question I had been carrying since I first read those expense records. The question had never really been about the affair. The question had been about something more specific, whether the woman I had married understood that a person's worth existed independently of what they could be seen to possess, or whether she had come to believe that worth was simply another form of measurement, no different from any other. The ring on the floor answered that question with the finality of something being closed and locked. I reached into my jacket pocket and closed my hand around the wrench. Not because I needed its steadiness, I was steady enough on my own, but because it was the truest object in the room, the one thing present that had no performance attached to it, and I wanted to be touching something true. I stood up. I moved away from the table through the stillness of the room toward the far edge of the event floor, past the broken glass and the overturned chairs and the 300 people who were now very quiet. And from the direction of the stage, I heard a microphone being opened and a voice beginning to speak. Ladies and gentlemen, before we continue, we have a special announcement from the controlling shareholder of the parent organization. The large screen behind the stage had been displaying the Blackstone Ridge logo for most of the evening, the clean geometric design that appeared on the company's presentations and letterheads and the lanyards being worn by every employee in the room. When the logo disappeared and the screen went dark for a moment, several people near the stage assumed it was a technical issue and looked toward the audiovisual crew positioned at the side of the room. The crew was not troubleshooting anything. They were executing a sequence that had been coordinated with Eleanor's office earlier that week, down to the precise timing of the transition. The new logo that appeared was one that almost no one in the room recognized on sight. Red Mesa Energy Holdings did not advertise. It did not sponsor industry conferences or place its name on buildings or maintain the kind of public presence that would make its branding familiar to people who had not specifically needed to know it existed. The MC, a polished man who had been hired to run the evening's program and who had been briefed on this portion of the announcement only 2 hours earlier, read from the prepared remarks Eleanor had provided. He explained that Blackstone Ridge had, over the course of its most significant growth period, been operating with capital provided in large part by a parent organization. He explained that the restructuring now underway would bring Blackstone Ridge fully into that organization's consolidated structure, and that the founder of the parent organization would be present that evening to formally address the assembled shareholders, partners, and senior staff. I watched this from the far edge of the room where I had moved after leaving the table. The broken glass from the overturned dinner service was still scattered across that section of the floor. The ring was still there too, where it had landed, catching the light from the chandeliers above. The room's attention had divided itself between the screen and the aftermath of what had happened at my table, and Celeste was standing where she had been standing when she made her announcement, but the quality of her posture had shifted, the forward momentum of the confrontation had stalled, and she was now watching the stage with an expression that hadn't fully settled into anything yet. Gavin was beside her, and he was watching the screen with the focused attention of someone trying to determine whether new information required a change of plan. Eleanor walked onto the stage from the left side where the door to the interior corridor connected to the secured suite upstairs. She stood at the front of the stage and looked out at the room for a moment, and then she looked toward the far right edge of the floor where I was standing, and she said into the microphone, "Mr. Rowan, the board is ready for you." The name moved through the room, the way a sound moves through a space that has gone completely quiet. You could feel it reach every corner before anyone's expression had time to respond to it. Several hundred people turned in the same direction at approximately the same moment. which is a strange thing to experience when you are the person being turned toward. I had been standing there without anyone paying particular attention to me for the better part of an hour, and the sudden collective focus had a physical weight to it. I walked toward the stage. The screen behind Eleanor had populated with an ownership structure document, a simplified chart showing the relationship between the parent entity and its subsidiaries. At the top of the chart was my name. Below it, connected by lines that branched and rebranched through layers of holding structure, were the assets that made up Red Mesa's portfolio. Near the bottom of one of those branches, clearly labeled, was Blackstone Ridge Petroleum Services. Beside my name was a figure $35 billion. I did not look at Celeste while I walked. I was aware of where she was standing. I had been aware of where she was standing for most of the evening, but I did not look at her because the walk to the stage was not a performance for her benefit, and I did not want it to become one. I walked past the overturned table and the broken glass and the ring on the floor, and I stepped up onto the stage beside Eleanor and I looked out at the room. What I saw in the faces of 300 people was the specific reconfiguration that happens when the information a person holds about a situation is suddenly replaced with different information. It is not quite shock. It is something more like the expression of a calculation being revised of a conclusion that had seemed settled suddenly, being reopened. The executives who had been nodding politely in my direction all evening were now looking at me with the careful attention they reserved for people whose goodwill they needed to maintain. The investors were watching me with the evaluative focus they brought to any situation involving a number as large as the one on the screen. And the people who had been near enough to witness the confrontation at my table, the overturned dishes, the ring on the floor, Celeste's declaration, were managing the particular discomfort of having watched something they now understood very differently than they had understood it 60 seconds earlier. Gavin had lost the expression he came in with. The assembled confidence, the easy smile, the posture of a man who believed he was standing in the center of the room's power structure, all of it had been replaced by something much simpler and much less comfortable. He was looking at the ownership chart on the screen, and then at me, and then at the chart again, with the focus of a person trying to locate the error in a calculation that has produced an impossible result. Celeste was not moving. The confidence that had animated her face during her announcement had been replaced by something I did not have a clean word for. It was not quite shame, not quite fear, not quite the simple shock of surprise. It was something closer to the expression of a person who has been speaking loudly in a room they believed was empty and has just realized from the quality of the echo that it was not. I addressed the room without notes. I said that Blackstone Ridge had been a significant part of Red Mesa's portfolio for several years, and that the restructuring now underway reflected a decision to consolidate that relationship in a way that was formally documented, rather than operating through the existing layered structure. I said that the evening's event had been a good one, that the company's people had worked hard to build something worth celebrating, and that the recognition being given to the team's performance was genuine and merited. I said that the transition process would be managed with as little disruption to day-to-day operations as possible, and that anyone with questions should direct them to Eleanor's office. Then I stepped back from the microphone. Gavin moved toward me from the floor, navigating around a cluster of stunned colleagues with the expression of someone who has decided that the correct response to an unexpected development is to treat it as a negotiation. He said something about the evening being an appropriate time to focus on what mattered, the people in the room and the work they had all done together, and that the personal dimensions of whatever had happened could be addressed in a more private setting. His voice had the careful modulation of someone trying to sound reasonable while the ground was moving under them. I looked at him and said, "No. The personal parts ended when the two of you used company money, company resources, and company authority to cover a relationship you knew created a conflict of interest." The sentence landed in the remaining silence of the room with a clarity that left no room for misinterpretation. Gavin did not respond. He had no response available that would have served him, and he was experienced enough at managing rooms to recognize when the room had moved entirely beyond his reach. Eleanor stepped forward and indicated that the formal documents for the board session were ready, and that the findings from the financial review she had commissioned several weeks earlier were available for any party who wished to examine them. The relevant people in the room understood what a financial review conducted by Red Mesa's legal office of Blackstone Ridge's expense records and executive decision-making was likely to contain. The picture that emerged over the following days through a formal investigation coordinated with an independent auditing firm was thorough and methodical. Gavin had used Blackstone Ridge's operational budget to cover personal travel on multiple occasions. The expenses were documented, the business justifications were non-existent, and the approval chain had been managed in a way that was designed to obscure rather than record. Beyond the personal expenses, there were decisions he had made in his capacity as Director of Business Development that had benefited a separate business interest. He held an interest he had never disclosed to the board as he was required to by the company's conflict of interest policy. There was also documentation showing that certain personnel decisions within his division had been influenced by considerations that had nothing to do with professional merit. Gavin was suspended immediately pending the outcome of the investigation, and when the investigation concluded, he lost his position entirely. Celeste's situation was more complicated, and I want to be precise about it because precision matters when you are talking about someone's professional life. She had not orchestrated the financial irregularities. The documentation did not support that conclusion, and I had no interest in asserting things the evidence did not support. What the review did find was that several decisions she had made in her capacity as vice president had been made in a context where her relationship with Gavin created a conflict that should have been disclosed. The failure to disclose placed her within the scope of the investigation, which meant her position would be held in review while the process concluded. I told Eleanor before the investigation formally began what I had decided: no one was to be pursued beyond what the documented conduct required. I was not interested in using what I knew to manufacture additional consequences. What I was not willing to do anymore was the thing I had been doing for too long, which was to absorb quietly and without response the effects of choices that other people were making with my resources and my trust. Marjorie found me near the end of the evening in the corridor between the event floor and the main entrance. She had the look of a woman who is recalculating several things simultaneously while trying to appear as though she is not recalculating anything at all. She said that family was family regardless of what happened at events like this, and that she hoped whatever came next would allow everyone involved to preserve their dignity. The word family in her mouth at that moment carried a different weight than it had carried at any of the dinners where she had watched her daughter describe me as the lesser half of a mismatched pair. I told her I hoped the same thing. Then I told her as directly as I could without being unkind if the number on that screen was the reason she was speaking to me differently than she had spoken to me an hour ago, then the number had not solved the actual problem. She did not have a response, and I did not stay long enough for her to find one. The formal divorce process began several weeks after the gala and moved through its stages without significant conflict. There was nothing for Celeste to contest in a way that would have produced a different outcome than the one the agreements and the law described. She did not try to. Whatever the relationship had been, she understood with the same analytical clarity that had made her effective at her job that the position she was in was the product of choices she had made, and that attempting to relitigate those choices through legal proceedings would cost her more than it would recover. I saw her once, about 3 months after the evening at the Sterling Crown Pavilion. She had sent a message asking if we could speak briefly, not through lawyers, not about any specific document, just a conversation. I agreed to meet her at a coffee shop near the neighborhood where we had first lived together, which felt in its way like a reasonable place to close something. She was already seated when I arrived, and she looked like someone who had been doing the kind of thinking that does not leave you visibly smaller, but does leave you visibly older. Not in the surface way, but in the quality of attention behind the eyes. She asked me why I had not told her. She said it simply without accusation, which I appreciated. I told her the truth. I said I had wanted to know who she was when she believed I had nothing to offer her. I said the information would have changed everything between us from the beginning, and that the only way to find out what we were actually made of was to keep that information out of the room. I said I was sorry the answer had been what it was. She sat with that for a moment, and then she said that she understood the reasoning, but that it wasn't entirely fair that I had placed her in a situation where she never had access to the full picture, and that some of what she had become was shaped by a distorted reality I had helped create. There was truth in that, and I acknowledged it. The distance between us had not been built by one person alone. I had my portion of the architecture to account for. But I also told her the thing I believed most firmly. The question was never about $35 billion. Anyone with reasonable judgment given that information would treat a person who possessed it with basic courtesy. The question had always been whether she could extend that same basic courtesy to someone she believed possessed nothing. What she had done at the gala was not a mistake born of incomplete information. It was a decision, a choice about what kind of person she was going to be in that moment, and she had made it with her whole self in front of 300 people because she believed the cost of making it was zero. She did not argue with that. She looked at the table for a moment and then back up at me, and she said she knew that was true, and that she was still figuring out what to do with knowing it. That was the last real conversation we had. Several months after the gala, Red Mesa opened a training facility in the town where my mother had worked her night shifts for 19 years. The facility was not named after anyone. It was not designed to attract press coverage or generate goodwill with investors because it was not built for either of those purposes. It was built for the children of the people who worked the fields and the pipelines and the maintenance bays. The people whose hands looked the way my mother's hands had looked. The people whose names would not appear in any annual report. The people who were the actual foundation of an industry that preferred to display its towers rather than its foundations. I attended the opening, which was modest by design. In the main corridor, inside a simple glass case, we placed the steel wrench, the one with 4 words scratched into its handle in letters that were uneven but deliberate. Not as a monument to me, but as a monument to the idea it carried that what you build with your hands and your time and your discipline belongs to you in a way that no confrontation, no public humiliation, and no overturned table can touch. My mother had understood that before I was old enough to ask her how she had come to know it. She understood it from 19 years of overnight shifts and $30 grocery budgets and a shoebox on a closet shelf, and she had passed it to me. The only way it can actually be passed, not through instruction, but through example. I looked at the young people who came through the door that first day, and I thought about what I had been at their age, standing in a town that smelled like crude oil, trying to read the structure of a world that had not been arranged with people like me in mind. I had read it anyway. I had found the overlooked corners. I had built what I needed to build. And I had learned, perhaps later than I should have, that the most important thing you can build is not a company or a portfolio or a balance sheet. It is clarity about who you are when someone believes you have nothing to offer. Because that is the version of yourself no one can take from you. That is the version that remains when everything else is stripped away. Respect that appears only after wealth is revealed was never respect at all. And your true worth is not measured by what you own, it is revealed by who you remain when someone believes you own nothing. If this story stayed with you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who only learned to see you after it was too late, then you already understand what Isaiah understood all along. Subscribe to the channel. There are more stories here about the people who built quietly, endured patiently, and let the truth do what silence could not. We'll see you in the next one.